Should coffee cake have coffee in it or just cinnamon streusel? That, my dear friends, is the question. That's hot. That's really hot. Cue the intro. Ooh. Coffee cake in itself has a pretty obscure history. So we do know that it would have evolved from honey cakes that were being baked in the late 17th century. However, these sort of coffee cakes would have been very similar to bread. So they would have had yeast, flour, sugar, eggs. They probably would have also had nuts and spices and dried fruit. And this idea of a streusel would not have been new. Streusel was very common back then, so you could have seen this on these honey cakes or coffee cake. There isn't one culture that can claim coffee cake as its own.
These are mine.
It's an amalgamation of multiple cultures. Now, I did see where Germany was serving coffee cake, but I also saw where the Danish had their own version. All we know is that coffee cake comes from a lot of different people's ideas, and we love that the best. Here's the thing, you can't talk about coffee cake unless you talk about coffee. So we're gonna spend the majority of our time today talking about coffee houses and how coffee houses really led us to coffee cake. Coffee houses date back to the 15th century. We had the first record of a coffee house in 1475. It was called Kivahan, and it was located in Constantinople. Now this is modern day Istanbul. They serve Turkish coffee, which is both a technique and a drink. Eventually, coffee houses made their way to Europe in the 1500s. And this happened because Vienna was invaded by the Turkish army. They left behind coffee, and those were claimed to be spoils of war. There was a man by the name of Franz Kolschitzy. He introduced the idea of serving filtered coffee with milk and sugar. And of course, the crowd went wild. Now, at the same place that he worked, this introductory coffee house, they started serving sweet pastries to go alongside the coffee. And the concept was concepting. It went through the roof. Coffee houses hit Britain in 1652, and they were places where upper-class businessmen met. Here's a fun fact. Edward Lloyd ran a coffee shop in London. Now, there were a lot of businessmen coming through, and this particular coffee shop eventually became Lloyd's of London's Insurance, where it still stands today. By the 1600s, the coffee house had spread from Italy to Paris to Germany, and eventually on to the American colony. Now, it is believed that Germany became the first country to serve coffee with cake, and this was just to balance out the sweetness to the bitterness of the coffee. Now, there were four main types of cake that were served with coffee. There was Kaffeekuchen, there was Klein Kaffeekuchen, there was Streuselkuchen, and then there was also a Gugelhumpf. Coffee cake recipes in the United States were first featured in cake sections or bread sections of particular cookbooks. But over time, they began to get their own section because there were so many varieties of coffee cake. And that just speaks to the popularity of the cake in itself. Now let's go back to the first question in the video. Should coffee cake have coffee in it or cinnamon? Now the typical US version of coffee cake doesn't have a single ounce of coffee in it. It's most likely a cinnamon spice sponge with a streusel topping. In the UK, it would be quite common for you to get a coffee walnut cake. Now this is a 2-layered sponge that has been infused with coffee. On top of that, it would be a coffee buttercream, and it would be decorated like so in a circle with walnuts. So their coffee cake would look quite different from our coffee cake.
Assemble.
Now, some of us weren't introduced to coffee cake via a coffee shop. Like, I didn't have my first Starbucks coffee cake for a number of years, mostly because they're very expensive. But a lot of us were introduced to coffee cake in one of these little packages. Short, small, perfect for a lunchbox. There are lots of companies that have coffee cake on the shelves, but one of the most iconic and one of the most popular is going to be that of Little Debbie. Now, Little Debbie's was a company that was started in the 1930s. The name Little Debbie's is not the original name. O.D. Keefe and his wife were selling pre-packaged cakes outside of their trunk or out of their trunk in the early 1930s. But by 1960, they had started to sell small packaged cakes, and really it became a hit. Now, according to my research, I could not find where coffee cakes were a part of the original lineup. However, based off of the timeline of what I did see, it makes total sense for them to have been launched in the 1930s along with other cakes.
Assemble.
Has such an interesting history, but I think we really have to lean into the coffee houses to give us more information about these delicious cakes. If you like this kind of content, make sure that you like, subscribe, and share with all of your loved ones. Oh my gosh, it looks so good. I mean, look at that. Can you see it? Wee bit of glaze for some extra sweetness. It's so soft. Bye.